Emma Donoghue began her career as a novelist in 1994 with the publication of Stir Fry, a coming-of-age story set in more or less contemporary Dublin. She has moved on to write 8 more novels. The Wonder is her 9th novel, which is kind of hard to believe. And it has been nominated for a 2016 Giller Prize, among other honors it's already received. And it is her second publication since the blockbusting novel Room appeared in 2010, which Emma set to an Oscar-nominated screenplay that she wrote, that also won her the 2016 Independent Spirit Award, which is one of the most, if not the most important award ceremonies for independent film in the world. Even before the global success of Room, readers who know things knew about Slammerkin, her 2000 novel about sex and murder set in the 18th century. Who doesn't like reading at least about things like that? Emma is not limited to the genre of historical fiction, although The Wonder returns us to that genre, wonderfully so in my view. She is an extremely able and capable author who has moved into a variety of genre over the years of her successful career. She is certainly a novelist in the first rank in the English-speaking world, which is one of many reasons I think we're so grateful to have her with us today. But she's also an accomplished playwright, essayist, writer of short, fact-based fiction. Her collection Astray, which was her follow-up to Room, is a collection of stories set mostly in the 18th and 19th century North America, which is one of the reasons I'm interested in it. And it was nominated for virtually every short prize award that there is. So she is extremely capable in so many different ways. And among her many admirable achievements is a long-term partnership with Professor Christine Rolston, who's a professor of French and of Women's Studies and Feminist Literature here at Western University. She has 2 children, Finn and Una, and she is, somewhat unfairly I have to say, a terrifically lovely and warm person. In addition to all of that, one of the truly admirable things about Emma's life in progress is that she's never had a real job for longer than 1 month. Finally, I think Emma is kind of the embodiment of what is wonderful about the spirit and ambition of this festival, which is that it brings together writers who are both local and global, writers of great esteem and accomplishment who we know, who are our neighbors, who are our friends, and people who are also really shiny. And Emma is both of those things. She is as warm and comfortable and natural in the setting of an NPR interview as she is entertaining friends and family with her partner, with her family here in Old South in London. It's a real joy to have her today. I'd like to welcome and invite you to join me in welcoming Emma Donoghue.
Thanks so much. You know how to make a local author feel really good. It's lovely to be part of Words, and in particular to have my dear friend Bryce to talk to me this afternoon. I was trying to explain to my son why I was coming to this, leaving him obliged to walk 3 blocks to his swimming lesson this afternoon. And he just kept on about, well, why did you have to go? Why do you have to go? And finally I said, what can I say, Finn? I'm successful. And and of course he had the last word and said, now you're bragging. So with my ego restored to crushed Irish proportions once more, let me take you back to 1859, the Irish Midlands, the boglands, the wet bit in the middle. Okay, it's all pretty wet, but the water collects in the middle bit, like a saucer. And it's set in no particular village, because I didn't think any one particular Irish village would appreciate my setting this story there. It is a fictional story, but it draws on many real cases. So I think all you need to know as I begin is that my main character is an English nurse called Lib Wright, who has been sent to Ireland from her London hospital for a 2-week nursing gig. That's all she knows. And she's, immediately disconcerted by the shabby little village when she arrives in it, especially when she finds that there's no proper inn for her to stay in. There's just something called a spirit grocery, like a liquor shop. Here we go. Mrs. Wright. Lib turned her head. The stranger in the doorway tapped his waistcoat. "Dr. McBurtie!" Ah, that was the name of the O'Donnells, physician, Lib remembered, the man who had hired her. She stood to shake his hand. Straggly white side whiskers, very little hair above. A shabby jacket, shoulders flecked with dandruff, and a knob-headed walking stick. 70, perhaps? "Good of you to travel all this way," the doctor remarked, as if Lib were paying a visit rather than taking up employment. "Was the crossing awful? If you've quite finished," he went on, without giving her a chance to answer. She left her dinner and followed him out into the shop. The servant girl, lifting a lamp, beckoned them up the narrow staircase. Lib's bedroom was poky. Her trunk took up much of the floor. Was she expected to have a tete-a-tete with Dr. McBurtie here? Had the premises no other room free, or was the girl too uncouth to arrange things any more politely? "Very good, Maggie," the doctor told the girl. "How's your father's cough?" "Better, nearly." "Now, Mrs. Wright," he said, as soon as the girl was gone, and he gestured for Lib to take the single rush chair. Lib would have given a great deal for 10 minutes alone first to use the chamber pot and the washstand. The Irish were notorious for neglecting the niceties. The doctor leaned on his cane. "You're of what age, if I may ask?" Oh, so she had to submit to an interview on the spot, although she'd been given to understand that the job was already hers. "Not yet 30, doctor," she said. "A widow? Yes, yes. You took up nursing when you found yourself, thrown on your own resources?" Was Dr. McBurtie checking Matron's account of Lib? She nodded. "Yes, less than a year after I was married." She'd happened on an article about the thousands of soldiers suffering from gunshot wounds or cholera in the Crimean and no one to tend them. The Times had announced that £7,000 had been raised to send a party of Englishwomen to the Crimea as nurses. That, Lib had thought with dread but also a sense of daring. I believe I could do that. She had lost so much already, she was reckless. But all she told the Irish doctor now was, "I was 25. "A nightingale," he marvelled. Ah, so Matron had told him that much. Lib was always shy of introducing the great Florence Nightingale's name into conversation, and she loathed the whimsical title that had come to be attached to all those Miss N had trained, as if they were little dolls cast in her heroic mould. "Yes," she said, "I had the honour of serving under Miss Nightingale at Scutari." "Noble labour," he said. It seemed perverse to answer no, but arrogant to say yes. It struck Lib now that the name of Nightingale must be why the O'Donnell family had taken the trouble to bring a nurse all the way across the Irish Sea. She could tell that the elderly doctor would like to hear more about her teacher's beauty, sternness, and righteous indignation. "I was a lady nurse," she said instead. "Oh, volunteer!" She had meant to clarify, but he'd taken her up wrong, and her face heated up. Really, though, why feel the least embarrassment? Miss N always reminded them that the fact of being paid didn't lessen their altruism. "No, I mean that I was one of the educated nursing sisters rather than the ordinary nurses. My father was a gentleman," she added a little foolishly. Not a wealthy one, but still. "Ah, very good," said Dr. McBurtie. "And how long have you been at the hospital?" 3 years come September. Remarkable in itself, really, as most of the nurses stayed no more than a matter of months. Irresponsible scrubbers, Mrs. Gamps in the old mould whining for their rations of porter. Not that Lib was particularly appreciated at the hospital. She had heard Matron describe veterans of the Crimean campaign as uppish. "After Scutari, I worked in several families," she added, "and I saw my own parents through their final illnesses." "And have you ever nursed a child, Mrs. Wright?" he asked. Lib was thrown, but only for a moment. "I would expect the principles to be the same. Is my patient a child?" He said. "Anna O'Donnell." "I've not been told of her complaint yet." The doctor sighed. Something fatal then, Lib deduced, but slow enough that it hadn't killed the child yet. Consumption, most likely, in this wet climate. "She's not exactly ill," he said. "Your only duty will be to watch her." A curious verb, Lib thought. Like that awful nurse in Jane Eyre, charged with keeping the lunatic wife hidden away in the attic. "I've been brought to Ireland to stand guard?" No, he said, "simply to observe." But observation was only the first part of the puzzle of nursing, she thought. Miss N had taught them to watch carefully in order to understand what the ill required and then provide it. Not medicine, that was the doctor's domain, but all the things Miss N argued were equally crucial to recovery. Light, air, warmth, cleanliness, rest, comfort, nourishment, and conversation. "If I understand you, Doctor, I doubt you do yet, he said, and the fault is mine. McBurtie leaned on the edge of the washstand as if his strength were failing. Lib would have liked to offer the old man the single chair if she could have done it without insult. I don't want to prejudice you in any way, he went on, but what I may say is that it's a most unusual case. Wee Anne O'Donnell claims, or rather her parents claim, that she hasn't taken food since her 11th birthday. Lib frowned. She must be ill then. Not with any known disease, known to me, that is, said McBurtie, correcting himself. She simply doesn't eat. You mean no solids, said Lib. She had heard of that affectation of refined modern misses to live off boiled arrowroot or beef tea for days on end. No sustenance of any kind, the doctor corrected her. She can't take a thing but clear water. Lib thought of the nursery saying, can't means won't. Has the poor child some gastric obstruction? None that I've been able to find, said McBurtie. Lib was at a loss. Severe nausea? She had known pregnant women too sick to stomach food. The doctor shook his head. Is she melancholic? I wouldn't say that, no. A quiet, pious girl. Ah, so this was a religious enthusiasm, perhaps, not a medical matter at all, thought Lib. Roman Catholic? The flick of his hand seemed to say, what else? And it occurred to her that they were virtually all Catholic this far from Dublin. The doctor might well be a Roman Catholic himself. I'm sure you've impressed on the child the dangers of fasting, said Lib. Oh, I have, of course, he assured her. And so did her parents at the start. But you know, Anna's immovable. Had Lib been dragged across the Irish Sea for this, she thought, a child's whim? The O'Donnells must have panicked the first day their daughter turned up her nose at her breakfast and shot off a telegram to London demanding not just any nurse, but one of the new, irreproachable kind, send a nightingale. How long has it been since her birthday, she asked. McBurtie plucked at his whiskers. April this was, 4 months ago today. Lib would have laughed aloud if it weren't for her training. Doctor, the child would be dead by now. She waited for some sign that they agreed on the absurdity, a knowing wink or a tap of the nose. He only nodded. 'Tis a great mystery. That was not the word Lib would have chosen. Is she bedridden, at least? He shook his head. Anna walks around like any other girl. Emaciated? Asked Lib. She's always been a mite of a thing, but no, she seems hardly to have altered since April. He spoke sincerely, but this was ludicrous. Were they half blind, his rheumy old eyes? And she's in full possession of all her faculties, added McBurtie. In fact, you know, the vital force burns so strong in Anna that the O'Donnells have become convinced she can live without food indefinitely. Incredible, said Lib, the word coming out too caustic. I'm not surprised you're sceptical, Mrs. Wright. I was too. Was, she thought. Are you telling me, Doctor, in all seriousness, that... He interrupted, his papery hands shooting up. The obvious interpretation now would be that it would be a hoax. Yes, said Lib in relief. But this child, she's not like other children. She waited for more. I can tell you nothing, Mrs. Wright, he said. I have only questions. For the past 4 months, I've been burning with curiosity, as I'm sure you are now. No, what Lib burnt with was a desire to end this interview and get the man out of her room. Doctor, she said, science tells us that to live without food is impossible. But haven't most new discoveries in the history of civilization seemed uncanny at first, Mrs. Wright, almost magical? His voice shook a little with excitement. From Archimedes to Newton, all the greats have achieved their breakthroughs by examining the evidence of their senses without prejudice. So all I ask is for you to keep an open mind when you meet little Anne O'Donnell tomorrow. Lib lowered her eyes, mortified for McBurtie. How could a physician let himself be snared in a little girl's game and fancy himself among the greats of science as a result? May I ask, is the child under your sole care? She phrased it politely, but what she meant was, had no better authority been called in yet? She is, said McBurtie reassuringly. She is, yes. In fact, 'twas I who took a notion to work up an account of the case and send it to the Irish Times. Lib had never heard of it. A national paper? The most lately established national paper, you see, so I hoped that its proprietors might be somewhat less blinded by sectarian prejudice, he added wistfully. More open to the new and the extraordinary, you know, wherever it may arise. I thought to share the facts with the broader public, don't you know, in the hope that someone could explain them. And has anyone done so? Asked Lib. A stifled sigh. There have been several fervent letters proclaiming Anna's case to be an out-and-out miracle. Also a few intriguing suggestions that she might be drawing on some as yet undiscovered nutritive qualities of, say, magnetism or scent. Scent, thought Lib, and she sucked in her cheek so as not to smile. One bold correspondent of the paper proposed that she might be converting sunlight into energy as vegetation does. Or living on air, even as certain plants are known to do, he added, his wrinkled face brightening. Do you remember that crew of shipwrecked sailors said to have subsisted for several months on tobacco? Lib looked down so he wouldn't read the scorn in her eyes. McBurtie found his thread again. But the vast majority of the replies to the paper have consisted of personal abuse. Of the child, she asked? Of the child and her family and myself. Comments, not just in the Irish Times, but in various British publications that seem to have taken up the case for the sole purpose of satire. Lib saw it now. She had travelled a long way to hire herself out as a nursemaid come jailer, all because of a provincial doctor's injured pride. Why had she not pressed matron for more details before she accepted this job? Most of the correspondents presume that the O'Donnells are cheats, said the doctor, conspiring to feed their child secretly and make fools of the world. His voice was shrill. The name of our village, Mrs. Wright, has become a byword for credulous backwardness. Several of the important men hereabouts feel that the honour of the county, possibly of the whole Irish nation, is at stake. Several important men, she thought? Had the doctor's gullibility spread like a fever among them? So, he said, a committee has been formed and a decision taken to mount a watch. Ah, then it wasn't the O'Donnell family who had sent for Lib at all. She saw it now. To watch with a view of proving this child subsists by some extraordinary means, she asked, trying to keep even a hint of the sardonic out of her voice. No, he assured her, simply to bring the truth to light, whatever the truth may be. 2 scrupulous attendants will stay by Anna, turn and turn about, night and day for a fortnight. So it wasn't Lib's experience of surgical or infectious cases that was called for here, she saw, only the rigour of her training. Clearly the committee hoped by importing one of the scrupulous new breed of nurses to give some credence to the O'Donnells' mad story, to make this primitive backwater here a wonder to the world. And anger throbbed in Lib's jaw. Thanks very much. Are we turned up? No?
No, not yet.
I only see mute or select. Are we select?
Weirdly, it's mute.
You press mute to make it loud. That's really odd. Anyway.
It makes sense to someone. Thank you very much, Emma. So I loved reading this book, and I can sit here and say that I just listened to you read from a book that I recently read, but hearing you read it actually sounds a lot different from the sound that was in my head as I was reading it, because I'm not Irish. So in my head, the book sounds like it's spoken by a surfer from Southern California, and when you read it, it sounds like it was written by someone from Ireland. And I'm wondering, when you're writing about your native land, about Ireland, what's that experience like for you in terms of crafting the language? Does it come more naturally, or?
The dialogue came easily enough, yeah. Though I still had to make decisions because there are aspects of Hiberno-English, meaning the English we speak in Ireland, which have become too stereotypical. So even if they're true, it's like certain bits of 19th century African-American colloquial slang as well. They're just too gone with the wind, So similarly, there are bits of Irish language, that just sound too Irishy, as we'd say in Ireland, too like begorra and begob. They may have said begorra and begob, but you just can't write that now. So I had to have a slight wince filter put in there for anything which would sound too, top of the morning to you, for instance. I think people did sometimes greet each other that way, but you just can't say that now. But mostly the dialogue came easily. I would say I had to do a great deal of research for the actual specifics of life in the 1850s, even finding out, what food they would have had. I was a bit daunted when I found that the potatoes wouldn't be ripe yet in August, so I was going to have to make up many other meals which didn't include potatoes, which was a bit counterintuitive, And I certainly had to do a lot of research on, say, the intricacies of Catholic theology and so on, despite having been raised Catholic. So I would say the dialogue, the language came the most easily, yes, yes.
Well, in the excerpt that you read for us this afternoon, the sort of anti-Irish prejudice that Liv brings with her from England was, very much kind of the forefront of her initial encounters with the doctor, with the family, with Anna. And as you say, you did a lot of research into sort of, the material life, social relations of the Irish in the 19th century. So what is it like as a modern Irish woman today, kind of reviewing that history and thinking about how to use it in a novel where you're, kind of representing a history of prejudice, certainly as between the English and the Irish in the 19th century?
Yes, a couple of Irish reviewers have accused me of writing an anti-Irish novel, and I certainly didn't mean it that way. But I have to say, it's a very enjoyable task to go back to your cultural history with a highly critical outsider's eye, because even when you're growing up in a place, there are always a few things that bother or bug or bore you about it. And so being able to go back in a slightly oppositional way is a highly enjoyable task. But I also, the main reason I make the nurse so prejudiced is that I didn't want her to be Little Miss Perfect. I knew that my novel would be almost entirely about Irish Catholic peasant characters who have strong beliefs, not just in, purgatory, but also in the fairies. So strong beliefs that probably many of my contemporary readers wouldn't share. And I knew that the nurse, even though she's of her time, she's one of the more scientific-minded people in her time, so I knew she'd be easiest for us to connect with. And so I didn't want her to be, the rational, sensible commentator. So I decided to give her baggage of her own, because to me, in a novel, everyone should change. It should be like a kind of petri dish. The interactions between characters should change them all. So I wanted the nurse herself to have to come quite a distance as well. I didn't want it to be just her spreading her light, among the ignorant peasants. So I thought it was very credible that as an educated English person of the mid-19th century, she would be riddled with anti-Irish and anti-Catholic prejudice. She would assume the worst of all of them. So in a way, I tried to set up the novel as a kind of a duet between Ireland and England and, the middle class and the peasantry and Catholics and skeptics, really. And even though I'm not saying I came down exactly down the middle, but I didn't want it simply to be the skeptics' triumph over the poor, credulous Irish people,
Well, and you put your finger on another question I wanted to ask about, which is, it seems, I don't think I'm giving too much away here in saying this, that it's very much about the education of the educated English woman, rather than what she brings to the story, which is that she's going to school these people and she's going to prove that they're all full of superstition and nonsense. And it's very much not how the novel goes in terms of Liv's relation to these people, to the context that she's brought into. One of the questions that I have for you also about your coming to write the novel is, as you know, there's a long history in the role that women have played historically in the church, and particularly around questions of fasting and privation and deprivation over the years, particularly in the Catholic Church, but in the Protestant orders as well. So what got you interested in this story, writing a story today about food denial, about food self-denial? Even if it's set in the 19th century, you're writing it today. So what goes into that decision-making for you?
Yes, it's funny. It's a bit of a soup pot. Most consciously, I would say I was inspired to write this novel by coming across one real case of a fasting girl. I heard about her about 20 years ago, and it was a famous Welsh case where the girl appeared to be living on just fine, and then the newspapers funded a committee of nurses to watch her, and she died very rapidly. So what interested me in that case was that the media and the medical establishment getting involved, bringing all their scientific, enlightenment to bear on the situation, clearly made it worse. Clearly it messed up whatever was going on, whatever trick or device, and so, day by day the girl starved. Now, I felt I couldn't write that novel because I like quite dark material, but there are limits, So I did not want to write the story of a little girl who starves to death. So I just sort of shelved it as one of those freaky things I'm interested in, but not write for a novel. But then I kept coming back to it, and I think I came back to it because of things like a friend of mine whose daughter struggled with anorexia right through her adolescence. What else? even childhood things, like I remember when I was a young child, the Irish Republican prisoners in Northern Irish jails started going on hunger strike to demand their rights as political prisoners. And even though I didn't share their Republican sentiments at all, I was obviously transfixed at the notion of these men starving themselves to death, and 10 of them died. You know, it was all over the Irish news when I was about 11. And the idea that you might be, you know, horrified by somebody's cause, but still deeply moved by what lengths they'd be willing to go to for it. So that fascinated me. Also, when I was a teenager, Ireland had an outbreak of moving statues. People became convinced that they saw holy statues of Mary and the saints moving and waving and weeping and so on. So it was, I mean, as I perceived it as a teenager, it was an outbreak of mass hysteria. And I remember feeling like, what is this country I'm trapped in? You know, it's 1986, get me out of here, you know. So that kind of mingled fascination and revulsion from some aspects of kind of Irish Catholic mystical tradition. I'd say that all fed into this, yeah. And also maybe I got around to it writing it now because I have a daughter of 9, and it just finally felt like the moment to write this story about a woman watching over this child and desperate to save her.
Well, and that brings us to another question that I have for you, and I want to say to all of you out in the audience that we haven't forgotten about you, so I do want you to start formulating your own questions so that we can turn to you as well. It does seem that this is very much a novel about motherhood, and about different kinds of motherhood. So there are various mother figures. There is Anna's actual mother, Rosalind, or is it Rosalind? How would you pronounce it? It's spelled Rosaline.
Yeah, Rosaline.
So Rosaline. Liv certainly takes on the kind of watchful, protective posture that a mother might. There is a nun in the story. Even the slavey girl cousin, you know, takes a kind of proprietary role. It seems also that a lot of your fiction in the last number of years has been interested in thinking about motherhood. Room, of course, is very well known now for being a kind of analysis of motherhood. So, is that something that you kind of developed as a writer consciously, or is it just something that started happening?
It took me by surprise. When we started having our kids, I thought, oh, I'm not going to write about motherhood. That's so boring and generic. That happens in every house on the block. Nothing special about that. But of course I found it fascinating, especially as, you know, the youngest of 8. I'd never had to be responsible for anything, and, you know, the only time I tried holding down a job as a chambermaid, I was terminated for low bathroom standards. So, you know, being a novelist is really not a very responsible job. You know, you have to walk in and have a nice chat on a Saturday afternoon, that's about it. So motherhood was a shock to my system, and somehow it started triggering this series of books in which I examine the kind of existential questions of parenthood. And yes, I'm particularly interested in kind of pulling the elements apart. I mean, in the case of Room, she's this great mother, and she's also, you know, she's the birth mother to this child, so their bond is, you know, biological and based on familiarity and so on. But I'm interested in when the elements don't match, you know, when it's not giving away much to say that Anna's actual birth mother, who's raising her in this novel, is a fairly sinister character. She's taking such pleasure in her daughter getting famous for not eating. Whereas Lib is a stranger to Anna. She has no legal connection, she has no tie to her, and yet she starts to care. So in a way I was interested in setting up different forms of mothers against each other, and in asking more generally, what do we owe to children? I kept thinking of the Hillary Clinton line about it takes a village to raise a child, and I kept thinking, well, in this case it's taking a village to kill a child, or to head in that direction anyway. So I was interested in all the varieties of passive negligence and evil, all the different ways that people are not stepping in to save this child. And you know, what qualifies you to be a parent apart from the blood bond, you know, what are the crucial elements of it? And similarly, I suppose with my last novel, Frog Music, I feature a very bad mother who stashes her baby in a hideous, what they call baby farm, you know, full-time daycare, shall we say. So I'm really interested in being analytical about motherhood, not just saying, isn't it lovely, you know? Because I know from my own experience it's often not lovely. And it brings out qualities in you that are not necessarily lovely.
Well, and one of the many admirable aspects of the story of motherhood that you tell, and the wonder, in my my view, is that there's a graceful case made for motherhood being a practice as much as it is something that one does biologically. So it's almost in a way kind of about the production of motherhood from a very unlikely circumstance, which is this sort of, not dour, but very serious nurse, who very much knows her own self and, is as a consummate professional in an age before women were even viewed as professionals. And yet, in many respects, the novel is about the emergence of Liv's own self-understanding as somebody who can take on that protective role.
Definitely, and I also really enjoy the fact that I get to take her job seriously, because if you're writing before the 20th century, very often your women either have no job or they're sex workers, that's the main choice. So to be able to write very seriously about a woman's job and have her take it seriously, and yet it having lots of kind of built-in ethical dilemmas as well, because she's been trained to be a Victorian nurse, which meant being always so obedient to the doctors and not questioning their decisions and kowtowing to them. So I wanted to set her up as somebody who takes the principles of Florence Nightingale almost as a religion herself. She keeps referring to Florence Nightingale's book on nursing, the way the little girl in the story refers to the scriptures. But I wanted her by the end of the story to have to be breaking some of those rules. In a way, she's come to take ownership of what it really is to be a nurse and say, no, sometimes to truly follow the rules in their spirit, you have to break the rules in their specifics. So yeah, it was very enjoyable to be able to, take the work seriously as well as the emotional changes, yeah.
Maybe I'll turn outward towards the audience now and see if anybody has anything they'd like to ask or throw into the conversation. If you've read the novel, please remember the kind of no spoiler request. We have a microphone that Josh Lambier here is going to bring up if anyone wants to ask something. And believe me, Emma and I can just kind of carry on here for a couple of hours if you like. But please do, don't be shy. Yes, in the front here.
Is this a plant? He looks like some student of yours.
I do know about it, but unrelated. So you've written, as I've heard, in plays, script writing, and novels, short stories. So that's quite a wide variety of mediums. Do you have a particular favorite? Which one is favorite?
I don't have one. I don't have one favorite medium. Sometimes I imagine a situation where, for some reason, the Nazis put a gun to my head and make me choose. Now I know they're not actually. No Nazi equivalent figures are concerned with an author's choice of genre, so I don't know why I imagine this. But if for some reason I had to choose, or if I had very little time and had to choose one thing to devote it to, I would choose fiction. Possibly because fiction gives you maximum power, And if these genres are on a sort of spectrum from solo work all the way through to very collaborative work like theatre and film, I would say fiction is at the far end, meaning that I get to pick all the words and I get to write it in great privacy. I don't have to show early drafts to my publishers even. I can really create this whole world and then only show it to them when I'm ready. And even then, the editing process is very respectful when you're writing, say, literary fiction as opposed to, say, romance or a crime genre. So, they make very respectful suggestions and questions and tweaks. But basically, you get to pick all the words. So I love that. I love the feeling of disappearing down this rabbit hole into a world that you're creating and making it all for yourself. However, I have so enjoyed the collaborative arts as well because there's such a contrast. Even say when I was promoting the Women film, we were a team, and we'd tease each other about how the guys looked in their tuxedos. And, there was this amazing sense of solidarity in both making the film, the shoot in Toronto, and also the promoting of it. So, and the lunches and the excitement when things happen, whereas with fiction, you're all alone. So again, theatre, it's different because it's more short term, but it's like this wonderful transitory flower, it gets so intense. the theatre process, and you're always like at the dress rehearsal thinking, this is rubbish, it'll never work, you know, and then the sheer exhilaration after the first night. So I basically love all these different genres, and I would hate to give any of them up. And above all, to me, the changing in genres has been very helpful to stop me from getting bored, because I've been doing this for a quarter of a century, and I think with a writer, the main danger would be repetition and boredom and staleness. So new genres are crucial. So I'm currently writing for kids, and that scares me more than any other genre, because kid audiences do not sit politely like you lot. I'm so aware that, you know, you have to keep hooking the child's attention, or they will. I've seen mine; they just literally drop a book and stand on it as they walk away. So yeah, I think it's very important to keep asking new things of yourself.
Yes, children are harshest critics.
Microphone in the first line, please. The question here. Thank you.
So how did the adaptation of Room into a movie, how did that change your life?
The adaptation of Room into a movie, did it change my life? And change your life is quite a dramatic phrase. You know, I've been lucky enough to be writing since my early 20s, and to me, that's the really big important fact, that I get to do this all day. So Room didn't change that, but it did open a little door into the world of film, which can be a hard world to get into. Like many writers, I had a couple of scripts in the bottom drawer, nothing had ever quite come of them, because basically film is so expensive to make. People have to be terribly sure of something before they put their money into it. So it's harder than getting published. And it's particularly hard if you're seen as an outsider. Film can seem like a bit of a closed world. It's also a very male-dominated world, and 90% of films are still directed by men, and 87% are still written by men. So, you know, it felt to me as if my initial efforts to get into that world had been rebuffed, and so I thought, oh, I'm busy writing other things, I won't worry about film. But then when I wrote Room, the book, and I thought this could be a film, I thought this might be my chance, because I don't want anybody else to write it but me. I know what to do with this. So I thought I would just go ahead and write the screenplay before the novel actually gets published. So nobody can stop me, or nobody can tell me what to do, or nobody can tempt me with offers of great screenwriters who will do it so much better than me. You know, so I just sort of did it myself sneakily, you know, before the book came out, which of course is just so, how, they do not behave like this in Hollywood. To them it would seem ludicrous to write what they call a spec script, like to write the script on spec without anyone paying you to do so. You know, that would be seen as just amateur hour. But, you know, as an outsider, I didn't care, so I just went ahead and did it. And then when I found the right director, a wonderful Irishman called Lenny Abramson, I was able to hand him the script. So instead of just saying, please hire me to write my own script, I was able to say to him, look, is this the kind of film you want to make? And he said yes. So we knew we were proceeding along the same lines. So it was a very unusual way to go about it, but it happened to work out really well. And it was a lovely experience, because it was an Irish-Canadian co-production, you know, your tax dollars and Irish tax euros at work. And I feel we went the indie route. It was a fairly low-budget film, only about $10 million. Isn't that ludicrous that that's a low-budget film? And we made all our decisions very much for art rather than commerce, and then it happened to be a big success as well. So it was an amazing experience, because you know, I'd said no to so many overtures from big studios that, you know, to end up at the Oscars anyway after doing it the more indie way was just such a delight, you know, and I felt so proud of all the Canadian talent in particular that went into it. You know, our cast were phenomenal, people like Tom McCannis, for instance. So it was a great experience.
When you're doing research and you chance across these very interesting characters in the past, real people, and they're sort of not murky, you're not quite sure what to do. Is there any particular character you've run across in your research you would love to take back for an evening and have a few years and just talk to them about their lives? Anyone in particular that stood out in your years of research for various books?
Yes, actually. I'm thinking of someone who I had to cut out of one of my books because he was a bit too distractingly, he was too eye-catching. I usually have a rule that I don't do name dropping. Like, you know, Florence Nightingale is a very unusual example. I really felt I needed her to be my nurse's teacher because there weren't lots of other nurses getting proper rigorous training in those days. There were just the kind of low-paid skivvies, and then there were the Nightingale nurses. So, but usually I try not to sort of refer to famous people in my books. But when I was writing my novel Frog Music, set in 1870s San Francisco, I happened to know that the photographer Edward Muybridge was around there at the time, and he was taking those phenomenal shots of horses and so on in motion. He was sort of capturing the secrets of motion with his series of photographs, and I knew a really colourful character, and I knew that he had often hired sex workers as his models, and my main character was a sex worker. I thought, oh, she could so easily have worked for him. So I got all excited and spent about a week researching him and looking at thousands of his images online. And then I found that he was actually too distractingly interesting, because he himself, he's the first person who's ever used the concussion defense in court. He he shot his wife's lover, killed his wife's lover, and then in court he said, oh, it was all a result of an accident I had falling out of a carriage earlier. And it's not quite clear whether the jury believed him or whether they just sympathized with this crime de passion, but anyway, he was let off. So, he was just like this, laser beam suddenly in the middle of my novel, pulling attention away from my main characters. So I actually decided I had to cut him out. So I think I left in one mention of my characters looking at one of his photographs, but basically he had to be erased from the novel. But it's such an interesting character and such amazingly ahead of its time photography. Yeah.
Well, if you had left him in the novel, all the American literature professors would have shut up saying, this is really an American literature book. We have to talk about Edward Muybridge.
Lady.
Once you finish the book, how difficult is it to transition and leave those characters behind and start something new?
Good question. I've never been asked that. And when I finish a book, you see, what is finishing exactly? The last time that you go through it to check the proofreader's changes, at that point you're focused on just that comma on page 20 or that date there. You're onto the minutiae there, so you're not really thinking at the character level anymore, and you certainly don't feel like taking some extra time with those characters again. You're so sick of it at this point after having gone through multiple copy edits and proofreading layers. So at that point you're just like packing it away, and of course I'm always writing something else already. So there's no moment in my life when I go, oh, the work is finished. It's always overlapping with other projects. And then of course, as soon as a novel is published, you're getting to spend time with those characters again by talking about them so much. So there's no one moment when you say goodbye to them. For instance, this is probably one of the last few readings I'll do from The Wonder, but then for the paperback next year there might be more. So it's like your children gradually leaving home. First they come back with their laundry, and then there are visits. So there's no one abrupt moment. Occasionally when I finish the first draft of a novel and send it off to the publishers, I might let myself have, a nice chocolate cake or something. But, straight on with the next bit of work that afternoon. There's no real break. I think when each of the kids was born, I stopped for about 6 weeks, but even then I was surreptitiously taking notes on my phone. Basically I don't like to stop. I enjoy writing so much that I like to keep going all the time. And I always have about 5 projects on the go,
It's actually a chance for me to leave it and ask a question I wanted to ask about character, and in particular the character of Anna. How did you come to craft that character? What were you trying to achieve in creating this young girl who is in the middle of this grand plot, kind of aware of it, perhaps not aware of it, has her own motivations, not quite sure exactly what they might be. What were the kind of pieces that you were thinking of as you were trying to put her together?
Sure. I knew I wanted her to be pre-pubertal, so still a child rather than a teenage girl, and I knew I wanted her to be not eating and be zealously religious, but that's all I knew. And early on in the process I thought, I don't want my readers to be despising her or laughing at her or just writing her off. I want her to be interesting. And I want her and the nurse to be a good match for each other. A good pair of antagonists. I wanted them each to be worthy of the other. So I wanted the nurse to be a very smart, very well-trained, very, mentally awake kind of nurse. And I wanted the girl too to be intelligent and in some ways likable, because I like to put my readers through some torsion, I want them to be thinking simultaneously, this ridiculous child is either a faker or delusional, but simultaneously for them to be quite liking the child and quite impressed by her in some ways. And above all, I didn't want the reader's response to depend on whether the reader happened to be religiously believing or not. So I wanted it to be an engrossing story anyway. So whether or not you believe the details of anything the girl is saying, I wanted her strength to come across, and I wanted readers to understand why religion was such a serious thing in the lives of these people. I think the most helpful book I ever read there was a book by Canadian Margaret Visser about a church in Rome, where she talks about Christianity as this kind of radical new idea that basically the lowly can be just as important as the rich and famous, that Christianity in its purest form was all about, the meek will inherit the earth, the last will come first. So the idea that this powerless kid who will, may never get married, won't have a job, won't have a vote, will always be poor, the idea that she, through this clinging to her system of religious belief, that she could see herself as as important as the Queen of England, exalted. So it was really important to me to take this child seriously, yeah.
Well, and I found that the depiction quite fascinating, partly because like some of the other, I think, great young women who are heroines in novels, I'm thinking actually of Richardson's Clarissa, of Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter, Isabel Archer, The Portrait of a Lady. They're fascinating characters, in part because it's hard to access them. It's hard to know exactly kind of what's motivating them, why they're acting the way that they are, what are the secrets that they hold. And as you say, it makes them more powerful, and it also just makes them much more kind of intriguing as characters because you want to get to know them.
You notice I didn't write the novel in the head of this child.
No, not at all.
I knew I wanted a child protagonist, but she's not my point of view character. I wanted to keep her enigmatic, yeah. And just as, say, in Richardson's novel, Clarissa is writing letters, but that's not quite the same as a novel that's actually in somebody's head. A letter is always in some way strategic. Similarly, this child, she reveals herself through conversations, and she says a lot, but that's not the same as being in her head. So I find the most crucial decision to make about any novel is point of view, who's to tell the story, and so sort of from what vantage point of retrospect, is it to be right in the moment, or are they telling the story years later? That's the kind of thing I sit around puzzling over for long hours.
How are we doing for time, Josh? I turned my phone off. Okay. Other questions from the audience? Yeah. Over here on the left.
Hi, thanks for being here. And I'm wondering about if you consider marketability when you're framing your protagonists, whether you think about whether a victim or a strong woman would be better for marketability or for getting readership?
This is a really good question. How much do I consider marketability in choosing my protagonists? I'd love to say not at all. And the funny thing is, you would think when you're like a starving, struggling artist, you'd be particularly tempted by visions of commercial fame, but actually you're not, because if you're already broke, you're thinking of your writing in quite pure terms. Whereas once you've had a bestseller, the little tempting demons really come swarming around. And your publishers never say it, but your publishers are always thinking, write something else like Room. And so you actually have to quite consciously say, no, I don't care, or I refuse to listen to those little tempting demons, because they are demons, because I believe once you start to court the market, you only produce some, second-hand copy of your own bestseller or of somebody else's bestseller. I really think that would be very dangerous. And I remember when Room was so successful in terms of sales, I remember saying to myself, I'm not going to let this book wreck my own relationship to my career. I've always written the books that I'm just fascinated by and desperately want to write, and I refuse to turn into some kind of, savvy churner out of bestsellers here. I don't want that. That was never what it was about for me. So yes, of course, I'm aware that some characters are more attractive or likable than others, but I really try not to be afraid of the idea of a book not selling. I think likability in particular, it's funny, I've had quite a few panel discussions with other novelists who are women, and they quite often say, why do we keep getting asked, how come our characters aren't likable enough? Does Ian McEwan, do Jonathan Franzen, do they seriously worry about this? So I would say that at the start of the novel, Lib in particular is very prickly. She's not easy to like, and I made the sentences quite stiff too, quite priggish to go with that, and the style of the book loosens up as she loosens up. So the danger is that early on people are feeling like, who's this nasty self-satisfied cow, you know? But you have to not fret about that. In terms of marketability, I mean, I noticed certain patterns in my book sales over the years. I noticed that when I write about lesbians, I sell less well than when I don't, you know. But again, I'm not going to let that stop me. And I don't feel that all my books have to sell well. You know, as soon as you have the mortgage paid off, you're free, I feel, you know. So, you know, I really try not to torment myself with those worries about marketability, yeah. And, you know, for instance, The Wonder, you know, as usual, if I described this book to somebody in a lift, they would look at me like I was a freak and they would try and get out of that small space quickly. So none of these storylines sound like obvious bestsellers, but my sense is that I just have to keep my head down and write my books as fervently as I can, and then some of them will sell. Oh, who's been waiting longest? What do you think? What hands have you seen before?
Let's get some right here in the middle.
I'd forgotten about the moving statues and Balma's Spittle. You brought it back to me. I remember going to London Library many years ago when you started out reading your books, and then the audience getting bigger and bigger. And I'm wondering how you balance your life now with all the publicity and the demands for travel and that.
Good question. How do I balance my life? Well, my son, obviously, sitting all embittered at the YMCA, having had to walk those 3 painful blocks, he would say I'm not balancing it. Yes, this kind of success does make things busier. And you have to get better at, oh, this sounds so like an article in a women's magazine, you have to get better at saying no to things. But on the other hand, my kids are older, right? So in some ways it was harder when the kids were small. I remember when our daughter was 3, Room suddenly got very successful and I had to keep flying off for more trips. And it's very hard to explain to a 3-year-old. You know, a baby may not notice that you go, and a 10-year-old you can bribe, for instance. But a 3-year-old is like, why you go to the airport again? And it's just heartbreaking. So it's a bit easier now they're older. But I would say a crucial thing for me is to keep writing wherever I go. So I've just done a 6-week book tour and I groused my way through it. I mean, not in public, I was very polite to the fans. No, then I'd ring home and complain again. But I would say what keeps me sane is doing at least some writing every day. Because although that might seem like more work, it's kind of very calming. It makes you feel you're actually doing your job, you're writing, rather than just talking about yourself. Because publicity can involve so much inflation of the ego, and then afterwards there's a kind of a deflation as you realize there are a million books in the world, why would anyone read yours, you know? Or if a taxi driver wants to know what you do and you say you're a writer and you list all your book titles and then he says, never heard of you. So actually getting the head down over the laptop a few hours a day and doing some writing is a huge help. And having lots of friends who don't take me too seriously, you know. And the disrespect of my children, that's very grounding as well. And yes, I said, well, I probably do say no to more things. I used to feel like, oh, I've been invited to Spain, I must go to Spain. And now I say, no, had enough. Because to me, what's crucial is spending enough time with my loved ones and, above all, having enough writing time. Those would be the two elements that keep me going.
I think we probably are at the point where we only have time for one more question.
Okay, I've seen this hand several times.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering if you found it difficult to translate your book into a screenplay, or what that process in general was like.
Sure, the book into screenplay transition. I think what helps is if you approach the task with real enthusiasm for the medium. Not like they're going to break the spine of my book and destroy it. It's not like that. It's more like, hey, we get to tell this story all over again with different tools. And a film has, there are things it can't do as well as fiction, and there are things it can do better. So for instance, fiction is great for keeping secrets, for only letting hints out very gradually. So at the start of Room, Jack drops all these little hints and you gradually put together your sense of the room he's living in. Whereas in film, the camera turns around once and you see where you are. So the plot moves on much more quickly. Film, on the other hand, is wonderful at ambiguities. It doesn't spell everything out. So there are many moments where in Room the book, you know exactly what Jack is thinking, and in Room the film you don't. You're seeing his great big astonished face, and you know a bit of what he's thinking, but you don't know exactly, and that's wonderful. That's engrossing too. Film also gives characters bodies, so you know less of what's going through their mind, but there are quite a few shots in the film of his little feet landing on different surfaces, and they are so moving. Film can make people cry more easily, especially when you add the music. I've seen grown men blub. It's such a pleasure to feel you're affecting people at a physical level like that. So I suppose I just felt, it's great to be able to tell the story all over again. And I'm now writing a play of Room. It's a play with songs, oddly enough, which will happen in England next year. And again, theatre brings out totally different pros and cons, because theatre can't be as naturalistic as film. I mean, film is so good on, the tiny textures of that room. You completely believe in that locked room. But theatre is great for that feeling of sort of a mother and son improvising their world, just turning everything into a toy, that the whole room is like this little, imaginary universe of fun they've invented for themselves. So again, it's different techniques and it brings out different things. So, at its best, I think an adaptation process can leave you with a huge respect for each of those two media. Thank you. Questions have been great. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the audience for their participation, and thank WordFest, Museum London, City of London, Western University, so many people who have helped bring us all together. And of course, I hope you will join me in thanking Emma Donoghue for taking the time with us.